adventure, exploration, discovery. The ideas that have tantalized Americans for centuries. From the very first British colonies to the expanding of the western frontier, and even to the depths of space, the American desire to explore has changed its face many times in the country's lifetime. Our most recent century is no exception. The 20th century, although not immediately associated with exploration, is the period of time that has most directly affected modern American views of adventure and expeditions in and outside of our planet. We often credit the 1800s with being the largest period of American discovery. This is with good reason. The westward expansion of the United States in the early 19th century was the largest domestic expansion America has seen in its lifetime. The explorations occurring in the 1900s, however, were much more outwardly focused. For this reason, it is easy to overlook much of the progress that was made. The shift in focus can be attributed to numerous factors. The most immediately visible one is that there simply was no more land to explore domestically. America had expanded from coast to coast and had, by this point, thoroughly explored its territorial appendages. With the exception of the acquisition of Alaska and Hawaii in 1959, no new states would ever be added. Even then, Alaska and Hawaii are both miles away from the American mainland and were less results of domestic exploration, but more so the results of imperialistic efforts in the early 20th centuries. This leads to the next major reason for the significant change in the nature of exploration. The 1900s started off with a substantial upscale of U.S. foreign policy. This strongly correlates with the election of Theodore Roosevelt in 1900. Theodore, or Teddy Roosevelt, is viewed today as not only one of the most popular presidents in American history, but also as one of the most active presidents in foreign lands. Following the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt inherited the country at a time when it was gaining its first overseas territories. His foreign policy focused specifically on elevating America's position in global policies. This set the stage for the end of the 19th century isolationism and a growing need for U.S. involvement outside the country. With the stage set for easy exploration in foreign lands, explorers and people with wishes to redefine the impossible became more and more prevalent in American society. As the American sense of discovery grew and matured, American culture began to, for better or for worse, idealize the cutting edge and dangerous lives of these figures. This was made most visible through effects of adventure and science fiction films and TV shows on fans. However, the enthusiastic reactions of average Americans and the government itself still reflected the idealization of explorers. The widespread public enthusiasm was especially visible around the rapidly growing industry of aeronautics. Following World War I, flight exploration and aviation quite literally took off. One of the key figures in this field was Charles Lindbergh. He was born in Detroit, Michigan on February 4th in 1902 and had served in Congress prior to his feats in aviation. Lindbergh always had a fascination for airplanes, and so on April 9, 1922, he took an 8-hour class with a stunt aviator, and from there, they began to plan flights. Just a year later, he bought his first plane for $500 and made his first solo flight, April of 1923. It did not satisfy Lindbergh to just fly a plane, but he wanted to push the bounds of aviation. Therefore, he decided to set out for the Orteig Prize. This was a challenge made by a wealthy financier that offered $25,000 for the first person to fly nonstop from New York to Paris. Lindbergh was trying to scrape some money together when he came across the St. Louis businessman who agreed to fund Lindbergh as long as he promoted St. Louis as the future of aviation. Therefore, his plane was named the Spirit of St. Louis. On May 21, 1927, Lindbergh took off from New York and landed 33 hours, 29 minutes, and 30 seconds later in Paris. He became an instant hero. People were behaving like Lindbergh had walked on water, not flown over it, which is a quote from New York Times. He was greeted with parades in both New York and St. Louis, as well as numerous job offers and interviews. On November 14, 1927, a special act of Congress awarded Lindbergh with the Medal of Honor, even though it was typically only given to heroism in combat. This demonstrated the high esteem that American citizens had for explorers. Even several years after his flight, he was awarded Man of the Year in Time magazine at the age of 25. He then went on to write an autobiography of his trips called We. Charles redefined the impossible, representing the idealistic American explorer. A few decades later, a new industry was capturing the hearts of Americans. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. This government administration appeared in the heat of the Cold War and was the Central American organization involved in the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Huge sums of money and resources were spent by the United States for the one purpose of beating the Russians to space. Although the Soviet Union sent the first satellite into space and accomplished several other feats before the US, America was still the first country to get a man on the moon. In almost every American household, excited citizens felt their hearts beat as they watched Neil Armstrong and his fellow astronauts take their first steps on the moon. This would forever change our national identity and create the idea that anything was possible, including the further exploration of the bounds of space. However, as the century pressed on, the sense of endless adventure was starting to fizzle out. Aviation had long since become commercialized, and the flights that once redefined the impossible were now staples in global travel. As for space exploration, excitement still lingered from the moon landing, but afterwards there was nothing that drew comparable attention. With lights dimming on physical explorations, American society was left to find a new source of adventure. A place where anything was possible: the movie theater. The Hollywood film and TV industry was booming. Black and white television sets were ubiquitous in the average American household, and color TVs were becoming more easily available by the month. The movie theater itself was also wildly successful. One of the biggest reasons for this new success was the rapidly growing adventure and science fiction genres. These films gave viewers a sense of excitement and discovery in a world that was becoming increasingly familiar. One of the biggest examples of a popular adventure film was the Indiana Jones trilogy. The three films, Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1981, The Temple of Doom in 1984, and The Last Crusade in 1989, were incredibly popular for their fearless main character, Indiana Jones, and his perilous adventures that he would undertake while searching for the unsolved mysteries of the past in exotic locations. Many revered Indiana Jones as one of the greatest collections of films ever. There are also many who see it as a more negative reflection of American culture at the time it was made. These people argue that the somewhat one-sided nature of the adventures taken by Jones, as well as his dominant role as a male, undermines society's perception of the films as representing freedom. While society is still debating this with many other films, it still remains true that Indiana Jones does reflect the desires of Americans who lacked a feeling of adventure in their lives. Another rapidly rising film genre was the science fiction, which was represented greatly by the TV show Star Trek. Star Trek entailed the intergalactic adventures of the Starship Enterprise and its captain, James Kirk. It was extremely popular around the time of its release in 1966 and for decades afterwards. It has been credited for having followings that have seemed almost religious in nature. Star Trek, like Indiana Jones, gave viewers a feeling of infinite possibility and excitement. This is why these kinds of shows and films amassed such a large following of average Americans. The mystique and glory that surrounds adventure and exploration in America has been a constant in its history. The 20th century witnessed the widespread idealization of the lives of explorers, and this fueled the country's passion to create and worship fictional characters that embodied the traits and feats established by the legendary explorers who were commonplace in the first half of the century.